Well, thank you all for being here. As some of you may know, there are some friends in the crowd, really close friends in the crowd, including my son's godmother, Sarah Elliott, used to be a parishioner here. It was nearly 4 years that I spent living and working in London played a pivotal role in my ultimately becoming a Catholic. Indeed, I was baptized in London and confirmed in London, albeit at a different church than this one. And yet, this is the first time I've been asked to speak about Catholic things in Britain, in a Catholic setting. And so I'm especially grateful to Father Alexander, St. Patrick's Soho, and the folks at Peterhouse for inviting me, and of course, all of you for being here. I've been asked to make the case for tradition, and specifically the Catholic tradition, and I'm delighted to do the best I can. But the very fact that tradition in our time requires a case to be made in its behalf should raise eyebrows. It should trouble you. To be in accord with tradition means, I think this is the best definition, and I received it from the priest who catechized me and received me into the church, means to live in ordered continuity with the past. It means that you have this sense that there are steps that you have traversed that lead up to where you are now, and they sort of point you forward so that you're in a kind of continuity with past, present, and future. And this is something that should come, if not always naturally, then at least intuitively. Your great-grandmother who baked a certain kind of orange cake every Advent and who passed on that tradition in turn to your grandmother, she didn't think to herself, you know, what I'm doing right now is preserving my family's sense of ordered continuity with the past. No, she just baked the cake. It came intuitively, organically. The minute you say consciously or self-consciously to yourself, I'm going to live a more traditional life, your very good intentions already betray a painful reality, namely that something has already been dislocated, that ordered continuity may have been disrupted, that tradition no longer structures ordinary experience. Rather, tradition has become a sort of lifestyle, one among many others that you might choose, perhaps even a luxury good. The very term traditionalism belies the confidence of tradition, which is, by the way, why I don't describe myself as a traditionalist, even though I wrote a book that Isaac mentioned a few years back, making the case for tradition in our time. So that book, The Unbroken Thread, sought to encourage the modern secular reader to take a second look at traditional ways of knowing and of being in the world. At the heart of the book is this simple, fundamental insight, namely that limits make us free. Or to put it another way, that to be bound by various natural or traditional guardrails is paradoxically a source of liberation, and conversely, the demolition of such guardrails actually leaves us less free. For me personally, that's been a hard-won insight. I spent the first 13 years of my life in Iran, a nation many in the West associate with traditional backwardness, with black hijabs and dour clerics, severe sexual mores, and teeming multitudes that fill the streets on Fridays to pray and to chant, "God is great." As a boy growing up there, I had already absorbed this judgment and made it my own. That is, I blamed all that ailed my native land, its repressiveness and the double thinking and double living it sometimes engendered, on our hidebound traditions. And I almost thought that I was an American before I ever set foot in the United States. I spoke English fluently with an American accent I had picked up from the movies, while still enmeshed in the Ayatollah's Iran. And I had concluded in my heart that what was Western was best. And Western meant American, it meant secular, it meant individualistic, it meant a life without limits, in short. It meant think for yourself and be yourself. It was a world you could glimpse in the films of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and the like, and its kaleidoscopic colors contrasted sharply with the black and white conformity of Islamic Iran. So again, by contrast, the emblem of the Iranian sensibility in those years was the young boy who, during the Iran-Iraq War, had strapped himself with grenades and dashed under an enemy tank. To earn his spot on murals around Tehran and to have his story recounted on state television, the model boy had blown himself to smithereens, consummating his devotion to nation and regime in this one irrevocable act of self-negation. So could you blame me for preferring, Luke Skywalker? No, America, or at least the America on display in Reagan-era cartoons and movies, was my true promised land. I pictured it as a sort of decadent 1980s Manhattan, and that's what I wanted. That's where I thought I belonged. But of course, when we finally did immigrate to the United States, the actual experience frustrated this dream of hyper-secularity and hyper-individualism. Thanks to the family preference visa program, aka chain migration, my mother and I had our green cards in hand. My father never left the old country, and we boarded a KLM Royal Dutch Airlines flight from Tehran, first to Amsterdam, and then across the ocean. As I followed the flight path on the tracker projected in the back of the economy cabin, I was puzzled that we didn't land anywhere close to where I knew Manhattan was. Instead, the aircraft flew on, all the way to a place called Minneapolis, St. Paul. But we didn't stop there. We then took another plane, this time to a place called Salt Lake City. But we didn't stop there either. Next, our family members who had helped us obtain those green cards came to pick us up, and they drove us to a place called Eden, Utah, population 600. We were now at the heart of Mormon country. And it was a deeply culturally conservative place with a communitarian rather than individualistic ethos, a product of the Mormon religion and a sort of country backwoods democracy in the 19th century. Of course, the religion struck me as an abominably weird faith. If I had rejected Shiite Islam with its links to Platonic philosophy and its bloody martyrology, I wasn't going to sign on with a religion that taught that the ancient Israelites had traveled to the Americas, tried to convert the native Indians, and failed, but recounted their travails on golden tablets, translated using magic seeing stones by a latter-day prophet in upstate New York. True story. Nevertheless, in the long run, America fulfilled its promise of radical individualism and self-definition, and then some. I soon left Utah, and in the years to come, I would revel in the chance to remake myself anew each day, as one can in the United States or really across the West. My moral opinions were as interchangeable as my clothing styles and musical tastes. On the long, it had outraged me to think that there were people still trapped in societies that didn't permit such experiments in self-definition. And I went from professional success to success. It became only easier to live a life of unbound self-definition, but also more anxious and dissatisfying. Something was missing, and all my searching finally led me, to my own surprise, to a chapel not far from here, where I was received into full communion with the Catholic Church. The restless search for self-definition had culminated in another person who promised me divinization if I would but abandon myself and eat his flesh and drink his blood. Now, the full story of my conversion I've recounted in a different book, From Fire by Water. And again, just FYI, my kids really appreciate your contributions of £2 to their college fund with every copy you purchase. In all seriousness, I also soon became a father. And that new role especially filled me with hitherto unknown anxieties. My recurring nightmare for my son, Max, whom we named after Saint Maximilian Kolbe, the great Polish Franciscan friar and Auschwitz martyr, was that he would grow up to be an unbound person. Now, this might sound strange to some ears. We constantly tell children, especially in the United States, that the sky is the limit to their success or self-expression. But the more I thought about it, the more it became urgent to me that my Max grow up with a rather firmer sense of the value of limits and a willingness to bind himself to something greater than himself. Now, my bad dream ran something like this. Max returns home after finishing college at some elite university. He plans to spend 2 weeks with his parents before striking out on his own as a junior associate at an investment bank or publishing house or some similar institution. And 2 decades of good nutrition, proper schooling, and rich extracurricular activities have yielded a winsome, well-rounded young man. He has clear skin, an easy smile, and the confidence that comes with knowing that life's material fruits are ripe for his pickings. One night, Max's friends stopped by for dinner. One is a Southern Congresswoman's glad-handing son, bound for Yale Law School. Another has just secured seed funding for a tech startup she launched as an undergrad. Still another is an environmental engineering graduate and has won a Sustainable Design Award and been named an emerging visionary by a Davos foundation. At this dinner, Max's mother and I take an obvious pleasure in our son. In him, we see our own love embodied and projected into the future. And let's be honest, the fact that this is the company he keeps reassures us that we've minimally succeeded as parents. Max looks set to be a winner in life. Yet the moment he and his friends open their mouths to speak, they talk mostly about money. They boast about entry-level salaries at their dream firms and how long it will make to take partner, the Fifth Avenue apartments owned by senior associates not much older than they, and so on. They might be well-read, but to the extent they discuss ideas at all, they concern themselves with the latest TED Talk about the power of making eye contact in business meetings, or the power of genetically personalized steroids to push your workout game to the next level. Max pays a certain respect to his father's faith. Sure, he tells me he heard the Mass at the college chaplaincy when he wasn't too busy. But if I push past this polite condescension to my sensibilities, he admits that while the Catholic faith might have some social utility, he doesn't think it should be taken too seriously. Most of his friends consider themselves to be very spiritual. In between semesters, they've taken trips to India where they meditated for days and subsisted only on bananas. They use meditation apps on their smartphones. They do hot yoga. They find consolation of a kind in the endorphin push of a long-distance run. These forms of spirituality provide temporary solace from the hectic pace of their lives without making any absolute moral demands. Well-being and self-care and authenticity are their mantras when it comes to dealing with others, not least members of the opposite sex. Attachments are to be avoided because they encumber the true self, who longs for maximal independence across life's realms. They all play around, even if they don't openly boast about it. Career ambition and restless competition punctuated by chances to blow off steam. Max and his buddies may not admit that this is what they take to be the meaning of life, yet the choices they make, and will continue to make as they grow older, attest that it is indeed the meaning that they hold most dear. And they're far from alone. Across the developed world, many people, elites especially, are making similar choices as we speak. Fast forward my bad dream, Max is now 47 years old, the same age at which his patron saint laid down his life for a stranger at Auschwitz. Having retired early from his firm with a tidy sum in his investment account, my Max is now touring Europe with his girlfriend in a luxury electric RV. The two of them have been cohabiting on and off for nearly a decade now, yet they have no intention to marry, much less have children. On the road, they seek out Michelin-starred concoctions for feasting, followed by nights browsing Tinder. Theirs is an open relationship. And this is the relatively optimistic scenario. It assumes Max hasn't succumbed to opioids or high-end synthetic drugs. It assumes he hasn't become one of those young men who spend months and years shut in their bedrooms playing video games and browsing the web. The Japanese call them hikikimori, though the phenomenon sadly spans the whole developed world, even if we don't have a name for it. Maybe fail-son, I don't know. Dad, I'm happy, he insists, if and when he permits us to talk about the course of his life. And the worst part of it is, he might be telling the truth by his own lights. He might not even know what he's missed. The thrill of meditating on the Psalms and wondering if they were written just for him. The peace of mind that comes with regularly going to confession and leaving the accumulated baggage behind. The joy of binding himself to one other soul, and only that one, in marriage. That awesome instant when the nurses hand him a newborn baby, his own. Having kept his options open his whole life, he hasn't bound himself irrevocably to anything greater than himself, and therefore hasn't exercised his human freedom at all. Floating on the flotsam and jetsam of contemporary life, he has never decisively reduced his potency to act, to use scholastic terms. Now, the book, The Unbroken Thread, addresses itself to Max with a series of difficult questions designed to poke at our contemporary certainties, with the answers drawn from a wide range of traditional sources, not just Catholic, but also Protestant, Jewish, classical pagan. Even Confucianism and the radical feminist Andrea Dworkin make an appearance. And time and again, these seemingly disparate sources urge the same idea, that limits make us free, that what appears on surface to be restrictive is actually emancipatory. So, for example, one chapter asks, why does God want you to take a day off? And it's about the Sabbath. Though it prevents us from doing whatever we wish for one day a week, Sabbath practice acts as a guarantor of inner liberty, as the great mid-century Jewish thinker Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel taught. While a Sabbathless society is one that lacks any rest and doesn't make space for that inner freedom. The Sabbath, Heschel wrote, quote, reserves one day a week for freedom, a day on which we would not use the instruments which have been so easily turned into weapons of destruction, a day for being with ourselves, a day for detachment from the vulgar, of independence of external obligations, a day on which we stop worshiping the idols of technical civilization, a day on which we use no money, a day of armistice in the struggle with our fellow men and the forces of nature. Is there any institution that holds out greater hope for man's progress than Sabbath? Asked Heschel. Or another chapter in the book asks, should you think for yourself? And it concerns authority, specifically the authority of papal teaching. The fact that Catholic consciences are bound by the dictates of a bishop in Rome, to liberal eyes, that has always resembled a sort of mental slavery. Indeed, that charge of mental servility has long been made against Catholics in this country. In the 19th century, for example, it was Gladstone who warned that no one could convert to Catholicism, quote, without renouncing his moral and mental freedom. Catholic authority was an attack on the conscience. Now, as you know, St. John Henry Newman picked up the gauntlet in defense of the Church and of the Church's idea of conscience and authority. And he reminded us that true conscience and true authority are really the same thing under different aspects. And it is in the absence of true authorities that the conscience is left swaying to the prevailing winds of fashion, of advertising, propaganda, political demagoguery, and so on. So again, it's only when we're bound to some authority that we can resist these external pressures on our consciences. Authority and mental freedom are friends and allies, not enemies. So this is what I desperately wish for readers to take away from this book. Freedom and limits aren't enemies. One last example which will resonate here is, why do we structure a lot of our important events in life, not just the spiritual ones, but civic ones as well, with tightly regulated ritual? Why does the coronation look the way it does? It looks fusty, it looks like a tradition that's been handed down from a millennium ago. But the coronation, and specifically the anointing of the new king, has that element of him humbling himself, right? King Charles, when he was anointed, is taking on the aspect of actually the anointed one in the Bible, and the anointed one in the Bible is ultimately crucified, so that the powerful in this enactment of ritual actually humbles itself. So again, something that looks fusty and restrictive is paradoxically speaking about emancipation, speaking about equality in some ways. Since writing the book, though, I've come to contemplate another scenario for my Max that's almost as depressing as the one I just recounted to you. And in all likelihood, this is the one that's more realistic. And it goes something like this. Max has achieved all the worldly success that I described earlier. Good schooling, a professional job, widely traveled, and so on. But in addition, in this alternative negative scenario, he's actually a fairly faithful Catholic. He attends Mass regularly, he prays, he supports the church, and he donates to other charitable causes generously. He marries and has children whom he raises according to the precepts of the church, and so on. All wonderful things. It's just that the world enveloping him is characterized by pervasive material degradation, eye-watering inequalities in wealth, ordinary people suffering from wage and health precarity, the loss of public space and the very idea of a commons, widespread pornographisation of the visual landscape, mass addiction to either digital screens or drugs or both, and so on. It's only thanks to Max's relative affluence in this scenario that he's able to live apart from all this. He and a narrow cohort of his friends can afford to retreat to a kind of suburban American Catholic redoubt where they send their kids to an Opus Dei school, manage to immure themselves somewhat from the wider realities of the world. This is no hypothetical scenario. It's something I see among many of my peers. I don't blame them for resorting to this model. In fact, I feel the same temptation myself. But we have to be honest here. That model is only buttressed by the upper middle class incomes. It has the aspect of a lifestyle or lifestyleism. At its worst, it can be hypocritical. You have self-described traditionalists or conservative Christians who lament the loss of social contact and communion between the economic winners and losers, the decline in civic and religious engagement, particularly among the poor and working classes, low rates of marriage and family formation, and so on. And they're right to decry these things. And yet many of these figures ardently refuse to link any of these cultural developments, which they, again, rightly decry, to the shape of our political economic order. Instead, they pretend that cultural and material conditions have little to do with each other, as if cultural norms and practices and beliefs don't rest on a material substrate that includes law, politics, and economics. The result is a downright ludicrous politics centered on preaching timeless virtues and tradition while denying what political theory going back to the Greeks has taught and what every good parent or teacher knows, that cultivating virtue, that sustaining tradition requires tangible structural supports. A child will struggle to master honesty if his parents routinely model dishonesty. A body politic will likewise spurn the virtues if it's subjected to merciless economic exploitation. Whatever the motives, this sort of pseudo-traditionalism treats tradition as a private luxury good, rather than what it should be, namely a structural public good that all people, especially the poor and working class people, can partake in. To live a life that's in ordered continuity with the past, much less an ordinary life of faith and virtue, shouldn't require heroic sacrifice. It shouldn't be the preserve of a narrow elite, whether it's a spiritual elite or a material one. Now, this claim of mine might sound scandalous to some Catholics, precisely because we're conditioned to think of faith and virtue and tradition as strictly an individual matter. They are an individual matter, to be clear, but make no mistake, from the perspective of historic Christianity, there was also a crucial public structural aspect to all of this. In the parable of the sower, our Lord warned his disciples that some gospel seed would fall among thorns. Suffocating cares, riches, and pleasures, Luke chapter 8, verse 14, are inevitable in every time and place, a temptation in every life. But what if an entire civilization becomes a vast bed of thorns that would choke the seed sown among it, except for all but the most heroic believers? Against such a backdrop, I argue that Christians, and more broadly people of faith, have a duty to act as gardeners, to improve civilizational conditions for the things we cherish, like faith and virtue and tradition. Many Christian thinkers today reject this duty, or if they accept it, they remain allergic to the specifically political or political economic dimension involving the exercise of state authority or the give and take of democratic life, which structures our public life in some sense, but has been completely removed from our economic life. They think the best we might do is to create so-called intentional communities like Anabaptists or Amish people. We prune our own little patch of the garden, the thinking runs, and let it stand as a prophetic witness amid the bed of thorns. Others locate this duty in the nebulous, supposedly non-political sphere called the culture, which Christians must evangelize. Of course, again, don't get me wrong, evangelizing the culture is important. Christians in every era are called to till the cultural field. Nevertheless, as political claims, these would have been unintelligible to the statesmen and stateswomen of historic Christianity, and likewise to its greatest sages. Here, I'd like to draw your attention to Prayer as a Political Problem, a brilliant little book by the French Jesuit Jean Cardinal Danielou. Danielou, his core claim was simple. Christianity, he argued, was from the beginning a mass religion. It was never supposed to be the exclusive preserve of severe ascetics and martyrs and Amish communards, and others who could abandon the world altogether and withstand any intellectual or physical difficulty for their divine master's sake. Such elites, he called them, elite in the sense of spiritual discipline and superiority, not material wealth, had their place, to be sure. But so did the crowd of baptized Christians for whom Christianity is hardly anything more than an external routine, end quote. Again, this can be a shocking claim, especially to Anglo-American heirs of nonconformist Christianity, with its ideal of intense, dour, solitary, subjective faith. But Danielou, a noted scholar of the Church Fathers, had the weight of Christian history on his side. Against the elitist account of faith, for example, St. Augustine proposed the, quote, picture of the church as a net in which all sorts of fish are caught, where the task of separating the good from the bad is for the angels, not for men, in Danielou's telling. And it is this state of affairs which is very much to be desired, end quote. But what about our Lord's warnings that to follow him means to carry our own crosses? For Danielou, those words have to be taken alongside Jesus' proclamation that, quote, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. The poor here means not just the abjectly impoverished and oppressed of the earth, although certainly them as well, but also the average masses, those caught in the clamor of commerce, in restless homes riven by petty jealousies, in the pretensions and hypocrisies of ordinary life. People unprepared for martyrdom. Jesus addressed himself to an elite core, yes, but also to such people. When he fed families and children, when he conjured wine for the partygoers at Cana, Jesus expressed, quote, this simple sense of community, Danielou says. It wasn't until after the Constantinian conversion, however, that the Catholic Church was able to secure political conditions favorable to a mass religion. Before that, owing to various persecutions, being a Christian called for a strength of character of which the majority of men are not capable. Post-Constantine, Christianity became accessible to the ordinary Roman. He may have been offering sacrifices to the pagan deities only a week earlier, and he may have struggled to get his head around some of the new doctrines of the creed, but he was a Christian all the same. His soul benefited from efficacious sacraments, and his family and community benefited from a more virtuous order, and a more Christian one too. Quote, far from distorting Christianity, wrote Danielou, this change allowed it to become more fully itself, a people, end quote. But as Danielou admitted, Christian peoplehood supposes a church which is involved with civilization, for if civilization runs counter to it, a Christian people cannot exist, end quote. I think this gives Christians today our public task. Our task isn't just to do our best individually, to live heroic lives of virtue, of faith, of passing on tradition, both in the capital T sense of the church's tradition, but also our ordinary, smaller traditions which nevertheless sustain faith and virtue. But it's also to create conditions in which ordinary people can begin to live lives in accord with tradition. So to go back to the example, for example, of the Sabbath. The United States and many other countries across the West used to have very robust traditions of Sabbatarianism, as the idea that public authorities should leave one day aside so that workers, all people, can be with God, can be with their families, can spend time with their children, with Scripture, and so on. That tradition was largely abolished over several centuries in the United States and elsewhere too. I can speak to the American experience. It was so robust at one point that George Washington, while he was president, was cited. He received a ticket from a policeman, a magistrate, because he rode his horse on Sunday from Connecticut to New York State. And throughout the 19th century, for the most part, these laws were still maintained. They were seen as laws that were friendly to working people especially. There was one exception where the Sabbatarian tradition didn't apply in the United States on Sundays, and that was postal service. The U.S. mail continued to operate, and this was a great source of, it was a great source of annoyance for mainly the evangelical Protestants who dominated American religion in the 19th century. Why? Not because they objected to people mailing stuff on Sundays, but because everything else was closed, the post office was men went to carouse on Sundays, and Christian women didn't like this. But they weren't able to stop postal deliveries on Sunday in the United States until the early 20th century. So why is that? Did the country suddenly become more religious over the course of the 19th century? Well, in some ways, but that was never enough through the course of the 19th century. The reason Sunday mail delivery stopped in the early 20th century in the United States is because the Christians found new allies in the nascent labor movement. And so once you had labor and Christians working together, Sunday mail delivery was stopped. Then over the course of the 20th century, as I said, the Sabbatarian tradition was chipped away at. Now, who did this? Is it the woke? Is it the radical left that got rid of the Sunday, of our Sunday, and made it much more precarious, especially for ordinary working class people? No, it was Chamber of Commerce Republicans. It was the right. The idea was we should be as free as possible to shop whenever we want, do whatever we want on Sundays. But the practical result is that, especially for working class people who work for corporations like Amazon, they have no sense of control or regularity over their schedule. So we lament the fact that people aren't going to church. We lament the fact that families aren't being formed, but we don't consider how our entire experience has been structured in such a way as to make it difficult for people to have a sense of regularity about their schedules. This is what I mean about what we should practically do. Of course, pursue individual virtue. Of course, try our best to transmit tradition, but tradition requires structural supports. Nearly 6 decades since prayer as a political problem appeared, the book was published in 1965, the thrust of our civilization runs more openly and aggressively counter to the aims of the church. The thorns are thicker and sharper than ever. Our task is thus more daunting than it might have appeared in Daniellou's era of wild ecclesial optimism. He was an expert, a theological expert at the Second Vatican Council. Since then, we've gone through the pandemic, when a novel coronavirus accelerated the economic and social trends that were already churning before the first cases broke out on our shores. We're seeing profound loneliness, again, massive inequality, growing health and economic insecurity, racism and racial tension, not to mention such thorny threats to the faith of little ones as pornography and gender ideology. These are the sorts of problems that the fathers of the Second Vatican Council entrusted to the laity when they called upon us to, quote, penetrate and perfect the temporal order, end quote. We must solve them at the level of the state. We cannot retreat to lifestyleism, even if some of us can afford it. You can give this sort of politics any name you like. These days, especially when I address political economic issues, I'm often asked whether I'm a leftist or a traditionalist or a distributist. Who cares? My answer is, I'm a Catholic. And as a Catholic, we're duty-bound to carry out the substance of Christian politics, to make conditions that are conducive to people actually practicing faith and virtue and sustaining tradition. It's the vision that stares back at us across 2 millennia, made tangible for any visitor to St. Peter's Basilica who spots the pair of earthly rulers standing on horseback at each end of the portico. Thank you very much.